All right, I'm going to start our unit on motivation here. This unit might be a little bit shorter than some of the other ones. Give you a little bit of a break here this week toward the end of the semester. And this is another chapter where there are a lot of different topics kind of subsumed under this general idea of motivations. So, eating, sexual behavior, achievement, all sorts of different things that are wrapped up into this theme that Khaled put together. But let's start out talking generally about what motivations are. So, we all have kind of a colloquial sense of what motivations are, a couple of useful definitions that might be a little more technical and helpful for us to figure out what we mean in this particular chapter. A need or desire that energizes behavior and directs it toward a goal. So this is an important way of thinking about it because it's not only talking about the actions that you might be undertaking as a result of the motivation, but what we might say is motivating those behaviors. The goal, the thing that you're trying to accomplish or achieve, is kind of intertwined with the behaviors themselves when we're talking about emotions, or sorry, when we're talking about motivations, rather. Another similar definition, a process that influences the direction, persistence, and vigor of goal directed behavior. And I like this definition because it's calling this whole set of behaviors and goals a process. They're all things that are working together, determining how hard you're working for something, how much you'll keep trying for it, and thinks about it in terms of, again, behavior that is in service of a goal. Your book has an ever so slightly definition motivation that still gets to some of these ideas, and they elaborate on some of these ideas later, but a process that determines the reinforcement value of an outcome. So that uses some of the language we're familiar with now from the learning chapter, but doesn't quite capture some of the things about goal-directed behavior that I think are really important to consider when we're talking about motivations. But instead of using that language, it talks about reinforcement. And I think implicit in that is the idea that achieving your goals or satisfying some drive is going to be that reinforcement. But I think that definition is just, again, a little removed from some of the processes we're interested in here. Tied up in thinking about motivation is thinking about some of the things that human beings and other animals tend to do in service of their survival. So we have a long evolutionary history by which we have adapted to different environmental circumstances and come up with, or rather, ended up with different patterns of behavior in response to that environment. And some of those things we might call instincts broadly, the way we respond to our environment. Unlearned characteristic patterns of responding that are controlled by specific triggering external stimuli. And this again harkens back to some of the stuff from the learning chapter, where you might sometimes think about maybe unconditioned stimuli and unconditioned responses as the products of instincts in some cases. That you don't need to learn these types of behaviors. There's things that we sort of do automatically. And I think we tend to think about instincts more in terms of other animals because we kind of like to put humans on a pedestal. But we are creatures, animals, all the same, that have different types of instincts that we respond to in our environments. Now, I want to draw a distinction between instincts and reflexes. Instincts are a little more complex than that. Reflexes, for the most part, are relatively simple motor or neurological responses, like, the doctor taps the little triangle hammer on your knee and your knee goes up. That is just a motor response to a really specific stimulus. Instincts have more to do with how these stimuli fit with our survival and our other types of goals. So instincts are a little more complicated than just simple reflexes. An instinct in animals might be, the instinct to migrate or hibernate at certain times of the year. And a good example for humans might be the types of rooting behaviors that infants engage in. That they are, searching for sustenance. They're trying to find milk. They're trying to position themselves in the proper way to be able to latch on to the mother's nipple and be able to, survive in that way. And that's a more complex set of behaviors than just like your knee popping up, that type of reflex that we might think about. So evolutionary psychologists think a lot about instincts and motivations and how, our current contemporary circumstances are a little bit divorced in a sense from our more ancestral, ancient sorts of circumstances. But we nonetheless, again, have these instincts. We have these very deep-seated, almost biological types of motivations for our behaviors. So to dig a little bit more into some specifics about the difference between instinct, drive, bringing the concept of homeostasis, I also want to mention that like measuring an instinct or measuring most any concept in evolutionary psychology is really difficult. It requires a lot of leaps in logic and some indirect type of thinking because you can't have somebody fill out a survey and say, yes, there's the instinct in the way they answered that question, or look at their pattern of behavior and say with certainty that something really isn't instinct. It's kind of a theoretical concept that we can't really directly observe. But we have some ideas about other types of underlying processes that have to do with instincts. A very important one would be a drive. So any kind of psychological state that is arising in response to something physiological that we need to address. And the easiest examples here are if you're hungry or if you're thirsty. You have a drive to fix those problems and kind of fix your physiological state. And by fixing your physiological state, what I mean is achieving homeostasis. So this is a process by which your body is keeping things stable, keeping things steady. So your body works toward homeostasis by having the proper internal temperature around 98.6 degrees, although I think that has changed a little bit in recent years. That average temperature is moving. But keeping that constant internal temperature, keeping the proper proportion of water and other liquids and compounds in your body, keeping your blood sugar regulated in a particular way, keeping all of the different salt ions that we need to keep our neurons running in the right balance in the right places. Homeostasis is a very complex problem that your body is constantly trying to keep in balance, basically. So we have drives that lead to different behaviors that are trying to maintain homeostasis in different ways, like eating to get proper nutrients, drinking to get water into our system. So the concept of a drive is a little more flexible than thinking about an instinct, because instinct is kind of this like highfalutin concept where you have to have this big theoretical idea of how we responded to different things in our environment. Drives are a little more simple, that we need to survive, we need certain properties within our bodies to survive, and we have a drive to maintain those types of stable balances and properties within our body. So I think it makes sense to think a little bit more in terms of drives than instincts, just because those are, kind of up in the ether sorts of ideas, or instincts are rather. But just a drive by itself isn't always going to be able to explain a behavior. We need to think about the types of reinforcement that are going on. It's not always about homeostasis. Sometimes it's about enjoyment. There are a lot of other things that are going on. So how do we learn how to get a drive satisfied and maintain homeostasis? Well, we learn how to do this in the same way that we learn anything else. From a couple chapters ago, we talked quite a bit about reinforcement and punishment, right? And you might think about the sort of physiological outcomes from maintaining homeostasis or not as reinforcements and punishments. If you feel better because you got some water after you hadn't had any in a while, that is uh, well, you might think about feeling better as a positive reinforcement, or the cessation of the bad feelings like dry lips or dry mouth or something as negative negative reinforcement. Things getting better either by adding or taking away sorts of circumstances. And punishment being, if you let's stick with the water example. If you don't drink water for too long, then you're going to have negative physical properties coming from that. So, a lot of motivations might be incentive motivations, that we have things outside of us that are leading us to engage in some particular behavior. And some of these things that have to do with drives overlap with this, but this is a much broader idea too, right? That, for example, trying to get paid for a job that you're doing. That would be an incentive motivation. There's some sort of external factor that is leading you to carry out that job, perhaps even to do it well, to be able to get paid and maintain that job. That incentive of money, or incentive of food. If you're planting a garden or something, it might be because you want to get those incentive sort of outcomes. We also might operate according to achievement motivations. So if we want to master some sort of ability or gain some sort of prestige in terms of our mastery of some sort of knowledge or something, or you want to get a job or get a position, get a promotion, these might all be types of achievement motivation, where you're driven to succeed in those ways. It's important to note here, though, that these things are not completely separate, right? That achievement motivation to get that promotion might also come with an incentive, that you might also get a raise, for example. So these things can be very tied up with one another as well. Intrinsic motivation frequently is going to be maybe a little bit separate from these things. Intrinsic motivation is more like if you are engaging in some behavior because of the joy of it. So that reinforcement there might just be the enjoyment or joy from doing something. So I think, a lot of times as we get further on in life, out of childhood, we're often doing things because of an incentive or an achievement motivation. But there still are things like this. But I think maybe the best example of intrinsic motivation are like children playing games. They're not doing it because they're going to get a prize or a position or a promotion or get paid or get food or money or whatever. They're doing it for sheer enjoyment of that activity. There's some sort of intrinsic reward to running in circles in the backyard and doing whatever it is that little children do. So that in some ways might be a little more separate from achievement and incentive motivation. But you can see how there are lots of types of motivation that both might overlap with things about physiological drives, but also might get into more complex things that human beings think about in terms of their status or the things that they're going to get out of particular actions. There are other ways that people have thought about non-physiological needs, and there's one really famous way of how these things have been all combined into one sort of perspective. So Abraham Maslow, somebody I mentioned in the first chapter of class, humanistic psychologist from the middle of the last century. You have almost certainly heard of his hierarchy of needs that he put together. So, there are many different kind of pictures of this. I guess your book has one that's slightly different. The labels are for the most part the same. But what Maslow suggested basically was that we go up through this hierarchy. If you first and foremost, you need to satisfy your physiological needs. You need to be physically sort of satisfied. You need to have your hunger and thirst taken care of. You need to be able to continue functioning, have energy, et cetera, et cetera. Once you've taken care of that, you're able to think about safety. And this might be things like shelter. or it might be more abstract things like a support system of people and a sense that the world is predictable and structured and organized. After you have that taken care of, you can think more about social needs like being loved, belonging in a group, having an identity that overlaps with other people. Then you might be able to think about things like achievement and becoming competent at different things, being respected, being recognized. And then finally, if you have achieved all four of these other sorts of levels, you can think about kind of the most abstract idea of being self-actualized or living up to your full unique potential. So this is the way, again, Maslow suggested this works. Needs are prioritized in a way that you can't really focus on being respected if you're starving or if you don't have shelter in a lot of ways, according to Maslow. But again, not all researchers or clinicians are going to agree that these things are hard and fast sort of order, because I mean, this might suggest then that if you don't have enough food and you don't have enough shelter, then you are not, capable of thinking about being loved or being respected or recognized. Which I think just a brief thought about that makes you understand that that's not true. There are certainly people that don't have those basic physical needs met that still have social and more abstract needs. So again, this is something Maslow came up with without much of a uh, set of studies or anything. It was speculation, and some people take issue with that, I think, for very good reason. But this still, at least if it doesn't necessarily fit into a perfect hierarchy, it still gives us some useful categories of different types of needs that people, might be motivated by.